Let's spend just a minute talking about what was happening in the career of the Stones in the very tail end of 1966 into early 1967. And this is really all just pretty much to set the scene for our discussion of the album Between the Buttons, which kind of crosses over between the years there. So let's say a little bit about that. Between the Buttons, released in January of '67 in the UK, going to #3. And in February of '67 in the United States, going to #2. I don't want to say too much about that album right now because we're going to talk about it in the next video, just to sort of show that it was recorded at the tail end of '66 and then released in the front end of '67. The single that went with it was a single called Let's Spend the Night Together. The B-side on that album was Ruby Tuesday, and that was released in this country in 1967. Well, I'll spend some more time talking about Let's Spend the Night Together as a song in one of the song close-ups coming up in a couple of videos here, but I do want to talk a little bit about the controversy around this song and what might have provoked it or how it came to be. The song Let's Spend the Night Together is a song about a guy pleading with a woman to spend the night together and have sexual relations, let's face it. And he makes all kinds of promises about being able to please her and meet her needs, both emotionally and sexually. And this was seen as just a little bit too much for many radio stations in the United States to go with. So much so that Let's Spend the Night Together was a #3 hit in the UK, but only made it to #55 on the charts in the US. Disc jockeys in the US who couldn't play Let's Spend the Night Together because it was seen as too risque, instead played the B-side, Ruby Tuesday, which went to #1 in the United States. So we have the interesting situation of the A side of the record going to #3 in the UK and the B side of the record going to #1 in the US. Both are songs I'm going to talk about in the song close-up coming up. So here come the Stones to the United States in early January 1967. They're going to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show, and we've said before how important this Ed Sullivan Show thing is for being able to promote your act. The Stones now have got a history with Ed Sullivan going back a couple of years now, and so here they are in '67, and they're gonna do the show and they're gonna do the song Let's Spend the Night Together. And the censors, the Ed Sullivan Show, say no, you can't say those lyrics. Sorry, not possible. Well, we have to. Well, if you're not going to be on the show if you don't change these lyrics. Well, what do you want to say? Well, how about you say, let's spend some time together instead of let's spend the night together. Okay. So if you go on YouTube or wherever you can find this clip and see Mick Jagger on the Ed Sullivan Show, you will see him singing Let's Spend Some Time Together every time it comes around. And when the camera is on him, sort of rolling his eyes like an irritated schoolboy that he had to change his lyrics, this kind of thing. But the story went around for a long time that he just sang it anyway, to heck with Ed Sullivan, we're rebels. But it didn't work out that way at all because these guys knew on which side their bread was buttered. And so, they went along and he kind of made the face and the song was, for all intents and purposes, banned on the radio, although they had a hit with Ruby Tuesday. Did he know this was going to happen? Did the Rolling Stones have it in their head that they had to reinforce this image of being bad boys? Were they trying to say things that they thought would be provocative, that they thought would provoke a kind of critical response from parents, that would reinforce their bad boy image? I tend to think they were. I tend to think they were looking for opportunities to offend. Not offend their fans. They were offending the authorities on behalf of their fans. They were the voice of all those kids who wanted to speak truth to power, but who couldn't, and so the Rolling Stones would do it. And they would show them up for being the kind of hypocritical, duplicitous kind of people they were in authority. Well, this would come back to bite them big time because, the authorities didn't think that was such a good idea to have these stars, these rock stars so flaunting the standards and morals of society. And so In just a minute, we'll talk about what happened to the Rolling Stones in early February that was really pretty much a way in which the establishment struck back at the Stones with more force than the Stones probably had struck out at the authorities. We'll see that in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about what was happening in late 1966 and early 1967 with other groups and other music. Because we're entering a period as we get into early 66, 67, and then through the rest of the year, sort of making our way toward their Satanic Majesty's request, that big album, where the Stones are going increasingly to head into psychedelia and these experimental tendencies that we've been seeing in Aftermath, and that we'll talk about in Between the Buttons, are going to get amplified more and more, and there's going to be more of that kind of thing going on. So just to give you a little bit of a picture of what else was happening in music, the Rolling Stones were part of a movement by a lot of musicians to take their music more seriously, to act more like artists than as craftsmen. You know, the thing about a craftsman is a craftsman doesn't worry about producing the same quality product over and over and over again. It's not a weakness, it's a strength. But an artist who produces the same work over and over and over again is seen as derivative, or recomposing the same symphony, or repainting the same painting, or recomposing the same poem. That's considered weakness. So you always want to try to do something new, to push the boundaries of art. This is the artist mentality. We see this plenty in the music of a lot of other groups. We've mentioned the Beach Boys, we've mentioned the Beatles. And we certainly see this happening in the Rolling Stones. So let's just sort of get a little bit of a timeline of what else was going on. The Beatles had released Revolver at the end of the summer in 1966, and in early 1967 they released a double A-side, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields. And those really are the kind of first indications of what's going to be happening with Strawberry Fields. Both of those tracks are what's going to be happening with Sgt. Pepper. Both of those tracks would have been on Sgt. Pepper's had it not been for the fact that they had to get some singles out and they couldn't wait for the album to be finished. So they put those out as a double A-side, Paul's Penny Lane and John's Strawberry Fields. Penny Lane going to #1 in the US, #2 in the UK. Strawberry Fields to #8 in the US, #2 in the UK of February of 1967. We also have the Beach Boys getting in even before the Beatles in October of 1966 with the track Good Vibrations, which went to #1 in both the US and the UK and was easily the most experimental pop single, you know, ever to have that kind of success. #1 on both sides of the Atlantic, and the whole second half of it is basically kind of cut and paste, almost modern music in a certain kind of sense. So that really started to set the bar for people like the Rolling Stones who wanted to play in that game as well. Right. So when we start to look at this music as we get into 1967, we got to realize that the Beatles and the Beach Boys were both really kind of pushing things as in terms of making their music more artistic and more serious-minded, right? So let's just keep that in mind. To finish out this video, though, let me say a little bit about why I'm choosing February of '67 to end this week and pick up again next week. The first thing is because we want to get into discussion of Between the Buttons as our second album this week. But also there is a big change that happens. On February the 12th, 1967, there's a drug bust at Keith's house. We'll talk more about that drug bust and the effects of it when we get into next week's discussion of the recording that went on in '67. The fact that they were on trial took up a lot of their energy and a lot of their attention. That really had an effect on their ability to find time to focus in the studio. The story as it goes is that there was a party going on, there was some acid being dropped, some pot being smoked, and they got tipped, the police were tipped off by a local tabloid newspaper that was happening. Apparently the story goes that George Harrison had just left the party before the police arrived. Some people have suspected that the police knew George Harrison was there and waited for him to leave before they acted on this bust. Brian Jones was not there because Brian Jones was busy working on a soundtrack that he was working on and couldn't get there in time for the party. And when he called the next morning to see if he should still come out, said Keith Richards told him on the phone, "Don't bother, the cops are here, we're busted." Well, this whole drug thing really changed things for the Stones in a lot of ways. First, for the next couple of months, things were kind of confused in their lives, and the way forward wasn't really clear for them. The second thing is there's a sense in which the Stones were picked on because they were the bad boys that they projected themselves to be, or that because of the way they projected themselves to be, they were made an example of. Right? And so when the trial actually happens in mid-1967, and they get a relatively severe sentence for the charges, I don't want to spoil the story too much for next week, but there's a lot of uproar and a lot of people, even within the establishment, feeling like, now you've gone too far making these poor kids examples like this. It's just not right. But it did embitter the Stones toward the authorities. And if during this period we're talking about 65, 66, they were imaged as bad boys, that experience, starting in February of 1967, turned them into real bad boys. It turned them into real outlaws. And then there was no more pretending. This is what they were. So this is one reason why this coming to February 67 really kind of marks a convenient endpoint for us. And so that's the way we'll do it. All right, well, let's move on in the next video to a discussion of the album Between the Buttons.